Officially start. So I'm Joellen Clary, welcoming you for JASNA, the Jane Austen Society of North America, Western Michigan region, at our 9th Monday for closing out 2 months of slow reading Mansfield Park. And it's been a trip. So I hope that all of you will even kind of share what that trip's been like for you. But let's see what kinds of loose ends are hanging and what we'd really like to talk about tonight. I do just want to point out that whoever you are, I think it, or even if it's not your first reading, I think it takes a while to get your bearings in Mansfield Park, especially with the load of expectations that we bring from the film culture and how so many of the novels have been read. But this one is different. And we've talked about some of the reasons why. Austen was starting from whole cloth after moving into Chawton, and went into full experimental mode. We have a new kind of novel, a new kind of heroine, and a much wider geographic area. We're in rural Northampton. We go to gritty Portsmouth, but we hear from London, and even the West Indies, which proves itself interdependent, and in fact subsidizing this world back home. So it's really been interesting to watch Austen attempt really a great deal more than she's done before, and to throw the idea and security of comedy into question for her as an author, we as readers, and the idea of home as, especially for women, always being a kind of safe and consoling place. So that's all I just want to kind of start with, and let's just see where we want to go. Wendy.
I want to say, in reaction to that statement, which was very nicely done, that I loved this slow read.
Good.
I loved it. I enjoyed reading it slowly. I enjoyed what we had to say and the coordination. I'm ready to start all over again. Because every time I've just been rereading the section as I was telling Susan earlier, where Edmund tells about his conversation with Mary Crawford.
Oh,
again, on a third or fourth time through, it's like, oh, notice how snarky she is when she said, "Oh, Edmund, is that from a sermon?"
Yeah.
Wow, that's a great line. So it's just that I enjoyed it, and I think we're all still here or returning because we did like it, and I would do this again with another Austen novel.
Me too.
Right. See, Susan's shaking her head because this was the pressure of reading a whole book and showing up is off. And there's enough to move us into the next section that kept us going through the book.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of following up with what you're saying, and I could read a piece out loud
if a favorite. Go ahead.
Well, but I guess before I would do that, I would like to know what you all said last week about the conclusion before I go ahead and read something.
Anyone have a nutshell summary?
She wrapped it up very quickly. That was my take. It's like we did the slow read, everything's moving at a pace, and all of a sudden, bam, it all just wraps it up, ties it up with a bow, and that's it, we're done.
And not just because we had first readers, but because of the way we were doing it and really paying attention, giving honor to the details, to the techniques, as well as the characters and the plot as we went along. It was very interesting to see that we couldn't really talk about much of anything until we got to that last chapter, certainly the last chapter or two. And very quickly, Wendy, we basically talked about those last few chapters, wrapping up Portsmouth as being entirely different than earlier in the novel. There was no Southerton kind of interaction and flirting. There was no, at the beginning of the book, remember we talked about how in free and direct discourse, or as it's sometimes called free and direct style, Welty got into at least 11 characters' minds. We kind of got to know almost every character relatively well. And at the end, we had letters that Fanny could read from a distance. She didn't know what was going on in the world she cared about, the one that had shaped her. They were like monologues. Edmund's talk at the end of, is it chapter 47, right before the last chapter? There's a monologue that takes at least a third of the chapter.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to. I was just rereading
Yeah.
this afternoon.
Yeah. And that basically, otherwise, we're in Fanny's stewing mind. And so the scope has absolutely narrowed until in that last chapter, it's kind of boom, this is what happened to everyone. And so anyway, enough about that right now. And that may be something that other people will want to pick up.
I remember early on when we were talking about Fanny, and I asked the question or made the comment, gee, given how she's treated at Mansfield Park, maybe she would have been better off staying at home in Portsmouth. And of course, everybody who's read the book, because I hadn't read it before, starts to snicker because you know what's coming, and I didn't. And so after I read that, I'm like, okay, maybe she would have been better off staying down in Portsmouth that way. Yeah, that was just a bad idea. So Mansfield Park was definitely, even with Mrs. Norris and everything else going on, better for her.
So as a first-time reader, what did you think about her ending up with her cousin rather than Henry Crawford? Because I feel bad. I kind of sort of spoiled a couple of days saying, oh, I'm starting to like Henry Crawford, and that bothers me. I'm starting to like him.
I don't know. Given her dislike of him and questioning his sincerity at the very, very beginning, I wasn't surprised. I sort of thought that Austen would have her end up with Edmund because they were just such a matched pair. But and Henry was, I never felt that, even though he said he was sincere, that he really was sincere about getting her to marry him. I still thought it was all the thrill of the chase, and not so much sincerely wanting to have her as his wife. That would have been the it's like, oh gee, I won. Second prize is I won 2 Fannies,
Right.
So
he reminds me doesn't he remind you a little bit of George Wickham? That he's
yes.
this charming character, but I think the first time you read Pride and Prejudice, you don't think like, ooh, watch out for this guy. I mean, the first time you read Pride and Prejudice, you see him the way Lizzie does, and it's not until we see the different opinions of him. We see Darcy's opinion of him, and then of course his behavior at the end with Lydia proves his character. And I feel like that's how it is with Henry too, where it's like, he doesn't seem great, but like, oh, maybe he's not so bad, and then he proves with his behavior at the end who he really is.
That he really was. Yeah.
The Henry and Mary, the Crawfords, are a pair. Maneuvering, manipulating through the world, and they have a veneer of that they have learned of polite society. They know what to say and how to act and how to do, but you scratch the surface just a little bit, and they're mean and nasty and self-serving. And all Mary wanted to have happen was for Tom Bertram to die, so that
so Edmund would inherit.
That's not all, to be fair.
well, she did want him to die. Once he got sick, it was like, here's my chance. He dies, Edmund, he'll be rich.
But if she wanted Edmund that badly, she had made some real adjustments. I mean, I think both Mary Crawford and Henry Crawford are far from the characters that we kind of thought that they were earlier on. And in fact, doesn't the narrator tell us outright that if Mary had married Edmund, that in fact Fanny would have gotten over it, and if had been just fine marrying Henry Crawford, and that he in fact did love her? She didn't say it this way, but was sincere. I think that we're right to think about, just how little it took to push him away, and
I think
pick up. But yeah, I think
Henry
that,
away?
but to stray when he thought, oh yeah, I could get away with it. But
I think both Henry and Mary are. I think Jane Austen is playing with the idea. I think all of her books are fundamentally about morality and what it means to be a good person in this world. And I think with the characters of Henry and Mary, she's really playing with, like, she's really calling into question, how what constitutes a person's morality. And I think Austen is leaving open the question of whether Henry would have made a decent husband or not. I don't think he's quite the blackguard that like maybe Wickham is.
No, I don't think so.
and you know, he fell to his he succumbed to his demons in the end. But I think it's an open question. Like he might have been an okay husband if she had accepted him. And I think it's an open question. I mean, obviously we'll never know. And the fact that Mary was just at her worst when Tom was sick, and she was hoping, and I mean that she even writes the letter to Fanny. It's so cringy, saying like, oh, it would be such a tragedy, but if it were to happen, that what did she say? There would be too fewer
poor men in the world.
Too fewer what?
Poor men in the world, because you know Tom would be dead and Edmund wouldn't be poor anymore. I mean, it's just unbelievable that she actually writes that. Like, oh, what bad judgment! But
She thought Fanny would get it and would sympathize with it.
Yeah,
Laura?
but she did fall in love with Edmund, even though he was the second son, and she could have tolerated his relative poverty if he hadn't been a minister. You know, like it's finding out that he's going to be a vicar that like really turns her stomach. She thought when she came to this house she was all ready to fall in love with Tom, and then she just found herself, like, against her better judgment, falling for Edmund instead. So you know, she's not pure evil, you know.
No,
but she
is a manipulator.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And she
Who
does.
isn't?
Well, but didn't Mary have a fortune of her own? I mean, Edmund was
Mhm.
going
Yeah.
to have a small income, but she actually had a pretty good income from
Yeah.
what I remember reading. Yeah.
I wonder what she
But
saw in Edmund.
For
I
those
really
who-
thought that they both could be decent people if they had married people who met their expectations. If Edmund had more money or had not decided to be a minister, she would have probably been a good wife to him, and same with Henry. But it's just that when they were faced with, something that didn't fit their parameters, they didn't really hold up as very
No.
good people.
Tell me if you think I'm off here, but until Tom was ill, wouldn't you say Mary was still leaning toward Edmund?
Mhm.
Mhm.
And I mean, she didn't have any expectation of a title or money then. And that's just, I think it's been Laura who said a couple of times that they both are just really rolling. We think, boy, they're reforming. They really are decent people at heart. And then something just tosses them over the cliff. But they both have gotten pretty far from where we would have guessed early in the novel, I think.
And with Mary, it's like being in London and being with her bad friends. I mean, Jane Austen seems to put a lot of faith in the influence of other people, that both of them, that Henry's been corrupted by his uncle who he lived with, and then Mary gets corrupted by these shallow friends in London. If she had stayed at the vicarage with her sister, things might have turned out differently. So I think she's really, I mean, I don't know if she's saying that these two people are flawed because they let themselves be influenced, or if she's saying people are enormously influenced by their surroundings and the people who are around them.
Well, thank you. Sorry. My
I
husband
have a
just
question.
dropped the
I have a quick question. Not being that as familiar with Austen and the novels that as you are, did she spend much time in London herself, or was she
Fanny?
mostly in the country? No, Jane Austen.
Oh, yeah. She had a
did,
brother
okay.
there and spent a fairly good amount of time with him. But even before that, they would be, they'd be going to London for one reason or another. It's a myth that Austen never left home. In
Okay.
fact, remember, she was going to Kent all the time to stay with one brother, going to London to stay with Henry. Even before Henry was in London and married, they were going and seeing various people. So yeah, Austen. But remember what we talked about, her limiting herself to what she knew. I mean, we hear about a trip to the West Indies. We don't get anything like the detail that Rosema tries to give us in the film, her film, but we get little bits and pieces. We don't go to London, so we have Mary's testimonials about what happened there. So because Fanny Price has only gone to Northampton and was in an inn, both directions traveling, and back to Portsmouth. That's all we hear about her responses from her. Austen's really careful about that.
Okay.
I'd like to jump back to Liz's point that Austen's novels, they're certainly written about as though she's really investigating or trying to set up moral centers. And a lot of people think that the moral center at Mansfield Park shifts from Sir Thomas at the beginning, a genial enough patriarch, but a patriarch, to Fanny at the ending. And I don't know what you think about that, but there is a whole lot of very serious commentary about Fanny, not just not liking her because she seems prim or a prude or whatever, but arguing that she's not necessarily good, that she's struggling with envy. And we talked 2 or 3 times about where she seems to be manipulating a little bit, letting her desires kind of be shown, etc. What do you think about that?
Well, I just thought the whole book, the thing that struck me when I read it was how little agency Fanny had. You know, she just simply had so little that she could call her own, that she could, that one room, the south room or the north room, her room. But
The East Room?
yeah, so I mean, it's perhaps she was using what little influence and little power she had but you know, she was so dependent on everybody, and you know, she turned Henry down because she loved Edmund, and she had to wait for Edmund. I mean, I just felt that people. My first impression of her when I read it a long time ago was that she was a wimp, and she was, you know, just an unlikable character because she was so passive. But this time, I just saw her as someone who just really had no agency and was trying to find somewhere, and you know, just some control that she could exert or some influence she could have even on herself. But
Interesting you say that. Again, because I'm so unfamiliar with this, I would read through what other critics and people had to say. And once Rose talked about that point as in Fanny as a heroine rejects obedience and follows her own conscience. So when she says, "Oh, I'm not going to be involved in the play. I'm not going to marry Henry,"
Right.
in their eyes, she's being disobedient, but she at that point is following her own conscience and being obedient to herself
And acting.
and acting on it.
Yeah, as
Yes.
we talked about the novel all the way through, can you come to mind or bring to mind other examples where we talked about Fanny acting? In Portsmouth, it's pretty clear. She has some money. She's bringing something into the home that hasn't been there. And so she can buy a knife to settle a quarrel. She can have a circulating library subscription, and she's being useful according to her own lights. But even before that, before and after, in what ways have we talked about Fanny acting in not such obvious ways? We had to kind of dig.
Well, she did carve out the East Room for herself, number one. So she migrated out of her little bitty attic bedroom and found a place for herself within the house that she could call her own. So that was sort of providing her with a little area that she could retreat to when she needed to.
Well,
On
she
the
did.
horse, when she got the
retreat there.
horse. Yeah.
Yeah, she did retreat there, and you know, Sir Thomas had never been in that room. Perhaps since his children had had tutoring and nannies, and he's looking around and saying, remember, he's saying, it's cold in here. What? But she didn't want to, I think she didn't want to bring anybody in because then she would lose her privacy. So she kept it just to herself and of herself.
A retreat. What else? When does Fanny act? She stands up to Sir Thomas, right?
Yes,
Mhm.
right. When she,
That's definitely taking a stance.
because
when
his position at his time and place, and it was not crazy.
No.
You know, he was behaving like a patriarch and a benign uncle, and would likely behave. Hey, you've got a decent proposal here. You should take it.
Well, you must take it more like, right?
Well, yeah.
Yeah. In fact, he says that had Henry Crawford proposed to either of his other daughters, he would have, you know, he more or less would have seen to it. He wouldn't have much to do, but seen to it that they would have married him.
And she even had a duty to do it to help her siblings at home. Because if she married Henry, then she could help them in the world too.
Mhm.
What about stargazing
Oh, when she and Edmund are looking out the doorway,
out the window
out the window.
when a glee is beginning? What do you remember about that?
I would like to go. I wish I could see whatever constellation it was that they couldn't see from the window. And then he said he would.
She tries to get Edmund away from the group and take him outside.
Mhm.
That has just struck me. I've said this 2 or 3 times to some of you, but struck me as a real exercise attempt at a kind of agency, pulling him away from Mary back into an activity outside with her that they had enjoyed in the past, that in fact was a way of being intimate. She fails, but she really has tried. So
That's interesting, Joan, because that passage struck me for a different reason.
oh, yeah.
And that is just because I can't recall a passage in any other Jane Austen novel where the characters look at the stars. I just don't, there's certain things that come up over and over again in these books: novel reading, dancing, walking in nature. Like those things come up over and over, going to Bath, going to London, reading letters. But stargazing, I just don't remember that being in any other book. So that's a singular scene for a couple of reasons, maybe.
And then we have the shrubbery. We've talked about the times when Fanny's rhapsodizing, when she really does seem to get out of herself. And that also, for people going looking, that has been read as trying to wrong foot Mary Crawford, like in Edmund's eyes, because of its stances toward nature. And remember, Mary doesn't do herself any favors there. The only thing remarkable I see about being out here is myself in here, that I'm actually here. So we tracked Fanny pretty carefully throughout this novel. What about, is Fanny a good person? What does that mean? I mean, I think that's an issue here.
Well, she's not a bad person. I mean, she's a person, she's not perfect, but again, she's kind of swimming upstream a lot of times, and making decisions and doing the best she can. But in what way would she have been bad? I mean, she didn't actively destroy Edmund's hopes, really, of Mary, did she?
No.
No, and she didn't. I mean, she was under no obligation to accept Henry. I mean, her uncle thought she was, but she put up with that dreadful aunt. She put
Mrs. Norris.
Yeah.
Does Fanny do enough to be judged as a good or bad person?
I think so. I think I'm going to argue that I'm going to be forceful here. I'm going to defend Fanny's honor and say I think she's a good person. And I think she's recognized within the world of the book as being a good person. There's the scene early when Edmund comes to her with his dilemma and says, if you tell me not to do it, I won't. I trust you. And I see that as, I may have brought this up at the time, as Edmund like outsourcing his conscience to her. And then Henry says something, I don't remember what chapter it's in, but Henry says something about being guided, like how he would always look to her for guidance. Is that what he says? And
Look
that's
to
when she
Fanny?
says the line.
I'm sorry, that
Yeah.
that Henry would look to Fanny, or Edmund look, I think I
Some
missed-
Henry. And it's when she says the line, "Oh, don't do that. We all have a better guide within ourselves if we would but listen." And so, she's making the pitch that everybody has their conscience. And so my argument would be, she's not a perfect person. She certainly experiences envy. She certainly is disobedient to her uncle. But even like when she gets accused by Mrs. Norris of being like ungrateful because she won't act or whatever, everybody in the novel except Mrs. Norris recognizes how unfair that is. Like, and we who spend so much time in her head and in her heart know that she is not ungrateful. She just, has her limits for what she can and what she's willing to do. So, and yes, she's, maybe in some level, I hadn't thought about the stargazing scene as a deliberate attempt to pull Edmund away.
I may be
But
the only person who said that.
Yeah, well, and I wouldn't,
Yeah.
I think if she does that, I think it's because she just wants to be with Edmund and spend that time with him, not because she's deliberately trying to
Oh, really?
stand between him and Mary. I think I think what she wants regarding Mary is, I think she wants Edmund to see Mary clearly. And she tries to do that. And there's a couple times when she tries, when she tries to bring up Henry's flirtation to Edmund, and Edmund's like, "Oh, you're crazy. I don't see it."
Mhm.
And she wants Edmund to see Mary clearly. But I don't see, I'd have to think about it, but I don't see her actions as manipulative. I think she wants the truth to be out.
I think
But
she wants that, but I do think she slides. I think that the people who've talked about, is Fanny good, have the wrong question. Is she perfect? No, which we've been establishing pretty well. Some people go quite a long distance in making that argument, saying that her, I can't come up with the right word to make this point sound semi-reasonable, but she's so willing to be run over, and poor little me, that some people think she slides just a little bit toward the sycophant Aunt Norris. But she basically, one other thing I think that's related to that is, we're in Fanny's mind a lot. Do we ever hear her actually analyzing her thoughts? Or are we mostly rehearsing pain and that kind of thing?
That goes to a question I wanted to ask about Fanny. She's in her mind a lot. She doesn't seem to have a lot of experience. She idolizes Edmund and wants to marry him. But is she really a candidate to be a vicar's wife if she has to go out into the community and do lots of different things with lots of different people?
It's a good point.
Manage that. I think she knows what a vicar's wife would be, and she would be willing to learn, and she would be willing to be directed. I think that she would be good at managing a household. I think because what she's seen in the time living at Mansfield Park is how a household is managed, that she's an observer who has seen how the dynamic of this family, and where she has fit a role and a set of tasks that Lady Bertram is dependent on Fanny to thread her needle and to take care of her while she's drugging out with her laudanum, and she does without her, but she really likes life with her.
Mhm.
And all of them kind of need Fanny as a foil, as almost as a solid center, which changes once Mariah gets married and once and is gone. The dynamic has changed. The number of people in the house are different, and everything kind of comes down in a new way. But Fanny's still central, I think, to that family dynamic.
She's made herself central. Would you say she's central, except in the last chapter?
Well, she's central in that a lot of action takes place with her and around her toward the end. Once this Henry Crawford thing starts, you know, everything is about Henry and this marriage and Fanny, and so there's a lot of thinking about why she will and why she won't. And all of a sudden, I think that she is infused with a lot more importance and personality that wasn't really noticed before. Does that make sense?
Sort of. I do think we're projecting, though. You know, pretty much when we're talking about the last chapter, we're projecting to some extent, and we're kind of looking for things to be base on,
Yeah.
which we do, which we can find throughout the novel. In fact, one thing I was going to mention earlier is that one way that Fanny has acted is simply by desiring Edmund. There's one point where whether, you know, it was typical for some cousins to marry in wealthy families or not, that was not seen as anything that would happen by Sir Thomas or Aunt Norris. You know, in fact, it seemed that they thought she'd be someone safe to bring into the family because she'd be his sister, which Edmund seems to, you know, think of her in that way for the most part. So Fanny's interesting, as we're proving tonight. Anything else or any other aspects of the novel, Liz?
I think that's a good point, Joellen, that we shouldn't project too much. That we only have
Well,
we have the text on which to depend, and
yeah, we
projecting
can't.
takes Fanny. Projecting is a different novel, which is what Colleen has done with
Updating Jane Eyre.
Jane Eyre. It's a different novel. We would take Fanny in a new place, and we have the Fanny who's here.
Yeah, but we do know her pretty well at this point. So as long as we're anchoring, you know, our speculations in what we've seen before, you know, what the distance that she's come. Anyway, there's a whole lot to say about her. Liz, you had something?
Well, I was just going to say that one of the things that I've just been fascinated by reading this novel, rereading the novel, is, you know, I've long thought that Fanny is somebody who, if I knew her in person, I probably wouldn't be friends with her. I'd be more likely to be friends with Mary Crawford. And yet, you know, I take her side wholly. Like an example being with the whole plot with the play, with the lovers' vows. I'm 100% sure that if I had been a cousin hanging out in the house then, I would have been all for acting. And yet, as I read it, I take Fanny's side, and I just think it's the power of the narrative technique that Jane Austen brings us so deeply into her own perspective that I think most readers can't help but share it. And one of the things that struck me is, you know, I think there's a famous thing in one of Jane Austen's letters to her mother about when she was working on Emma. And she wrote, you know, that I'm writing a novel about a character who nobody but myself will much like, you know. And yeah, of course we all love Emma, but like Emma and Fanny are polar opposites in terms of their motivations and personality style and all of that. So I'm so interested in the project that Jane Austen has going on here, where it's almost as if she sets herself up for a challenge. Like, I'm going to make my heroine somebody who, if you met her in real life, you wouldn't like her. But damn it, I'm going to make you like her and think that she's right. And, you know, and I'm just so interested in how she succeeds in doing that through narrative technique. And I
one
know
thing that-
it doesn't work on every reader. I know there's
Yeah,
people who
yeah.
don't like Fanny. I think most people who read Emma like Emma, but I'm so interested in that.
Thanks.
Well, it struck me that too, that Emma is wrong and she changes. She learns something. She,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
Elizabeth Bennet is wrong and she learns something and she sees something more clearly. And I'm
Yeah.
trying to remember in Persuasion, I know the plot, but I can't remember. My recollection is that the heroine doesn't marry the guy because everybody tells her not to.
Mhm.
Because
But
her aunt, the lady friend, her mother's friend, tells her not to.
but and then but in this story, Fanny doesn't make that transition. She doesn't
Hmm.
change from being wrong
It's
to
interesting.
having more insight and more understanding of her mistakes. She doesn't make
Mhm.
mistakes. She's basically got good judgment. And so that's a different feel because you're
That's
kind of waiting for
interesting.
that. If you're waiting for that, you're waiting for her to go over a hump and learn something or do something. And
Mm,
she never does. She just stays steady. And
that's
maybe that's
interesting.
part of being the central part of the family in a lot of ways. Like you said, she's kind of the middle, she's the center of the household, but in a lot of ways. But it's a different dynamic for a heroine than
I think
Austen's other.
I think we're tempted to think Fanny's central to the household long before she is, because we are in such a privileged position. We're in her, have some sense of her mind that she's an observer. Think about how virtually everyone else would consider her. She's sitting back watching and not revealing much of herself. Even at, by the end, Henry Crawford misinterprets her, remember, because of her gentle aspect. He couldn't interpret what she meant. So she works through that all the way. But I think we see her very differently than she's seen by most characters in the novel. And that's because we're manipulated by the free and direct discourse. What we're kind of talking about here, how does Austen balance? We've talked about romance and realism, but how does she balance our continued desire to hope for improvement in the characters when we are so steadily doused with grim realities?
Okay, I guess improvement is a theme in the novel throughout. And the word is used again, and it refers to landscaping and then into character. But if we work on the definition of improvement, everyone is improved in some way. If improvement means change, there's change. It's not as much change as Judith is referring to in Anne Wentworth or in Lizzie Bennet, but there's a lot of change and improvement throughout. And then the last chapters, it's wrapped up. Well, this one and this one and this one, and everybody's got a few sentences that gives their improvement. I mean, Sir Thomas is improved, and young Tom is improved, and Fanny's improved, and Edmund is improved, and
Maria, not so much.
Yeah, Maria, Mrs. Norris
Maria, not so much.
vanished
no, Maria,
overseas.
not so
Or
much.
Mrs. Norris.
And
Mrs. Norris, yeah.
But they're isolated. They're sent off.
Yeah, they're sent away.
They're punished. Yeah.
They're in their own prison camp. They've gone up to the gulag.
Well, France,
Oh.
but yeah.
Julia was improved too, right? Julia was able to, come back into the family and.
Yeah, I think in a limited way, we're told that Yates wasn't as bad as Sir Thomas expected him to be, and had more money, had more resources.
His debts
But
weren't as bad,
remember,
and his income was better.
yeah, but we're told Julia never would have married him if she hadn't panicked by the situation. So there are some pretty brutal bits and pieces, details that we're told here.
Yeah,
Anything
that
else?
really hadn't struck me how Julia's prospects were absolutely diminished by Mariah's actions. It's like, oh my gosh,
Mhm.
who's going to want to marry the other sister if the
Exactly.
first one did that?
Mhm.
Oh, yeah,
Right.
that really hadn't crossed my mind.
We
Yeah.
see that in Pride and Prejudice too. Those of you
Right.
who
Mhm.
remember that Mr. Collins says when Lydia elopes, no one is going to want to have anything to do with
For who, as
the
Lady
daughter.
Catherine de Bourgh so condescendingly said, would align themselves with such a family.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
and the sisters say we're ruined. Lydia's ruined. We're all ruined.
Yeah. Melissa, what are you putting in
Yeah,
into
Melissa,
that?
would you
I've seen
elaborate on
Yeah.
your comment?
but I haven't seen what.
I'm just chatting away in the chat,
Yes, you are.
That last point
mostly
was
to
really good.
myself.
Save it and share it with us then. Anything you want to share?
I think, when I think about this novel, I think about the key words that Austen uses repeatedly. And I think with double meaning, Fanny is, like I put in the chat, she's useful because she wants to be helpful, but she's also useful in that she's essential for the plot of this book. It matters that Fanny's there. This isn't a story without Fanny, and not just the last chapter, but throughout. And I think act is another word we can look at with double meaning. Fanny says, I can't act. She's meaning she's not, theatrical, but she also has a trouble standing up for herself and taking action. So there's a double kind of meaning, I think, with that word
Okay.
act. And I think the whole idea of these schemes and how they don't play out. Fanny is the first scheme, getting her into the house. And then there's all these schemes about who's going to marry who, and who might marry who, and who's the best setup. All of those things fall apart, except for that Fanny coming into the house improves all of them in a way that they didn't expect. When she's gone from Mansfield Park, they all kind of fall apart. She's the missing link for this family. So I think another word there is improvement that, Austen's working with. What's improving, who's improving. And I think she's also playing with the perspective of the reader. We're put in the shoes to begin with of the folks at Mansfield Park. We're looking at Fanny. We're meant to look at Fanny as this poor child who needs a better life. But I think that puts us behind, because what Fanny does is come there and show them how their lives can be better. They give her a better life in terms of having a nicer home and better clothes and better food and all of those things, but she gives them something richer than that, a better understanding of marriage and why it matters to marry the right person. I think that's another real theme of this book, like, who should I marry and what does marriage look like? We see that defined in so many different ways. The Bertrams, Fanny's own parents, all these terrible marriages that play out in front of her, so that she's forever looking at marriage and examining it through all these different relationships that are in front of her.
Watching from her vantage point, she's watching, observing, and watching. If we take the word improvement, and her action is watching, we could take that word and add that other meaning to it.
Mm-hmm.
But Austen won't let us get very smug about any of that. In the end, she really makes it clear that Fanny's marriage to Edmund was entirely inadvertent, accident caused by Henry Crawford's sin, what happened after that, or it most likely wouldn't have happened. So we kind of have to throw that in the hopper too. She's keeping things stirred up for us.
Yeah. That's good. She never really, in this book at least, never really lands anywhere, sort of. She doesn't say this could have happened, or this could have happened. This is it's a little I want to not say shaky, but it has a certain instability to it. A lot of the things that happen, it could have happened otherwise. And that's a good point.
That's how Rosema ends her film, remember? It could have happened this way, but it didn't. Repeatedly. An interesting repetition there. We do not get into Sir Thomas's mind until when?
Not much about Sir Thomas, actually.
That's a good, what do you mean? I mean, it's a good question, but
I mean, is it the last chapter?
when he softens up and
Well, when, I mean, through free and direct discourse or whatever, yeah. We're told his thoughts, changes. Before that, he's been pretty opaque, hasn't he?
Except for encouraging Fanny to marry Henry Crawford. I mean, he was very straightforward about that, that this is how things work. This is your position. You should accept him. So that's probably the first time we hear him actually.
Well, yeah,
offer
that
an
was a
opinion.
dramatic situation.
Yeah.
Where we're hearing him speak.
Yeah, I think, you know, we have a good sense of where his head is in that episode, both from what he says to Fanny in that scene in her room, and also the reports that we have that I think are indirect of his conversations with Edmund. So I think we have we're not inside his head, but from the conversations he has with people, we have a pretty good sense of what he's thinking. But at the end, it's a different kind of revelation of his thought when he realizes that he put too much trust in Mrs. Norris. He realizes the flaws in his own parenting, right? He realizes that the combination of his strictness and her indulgence was toxic for these girls, and blames, I think, takes some blame in his own head. I'm sure he doesn't say that to anyone else, but in his own head, I think he does.
Yeah, there's several paragraphs in that last chapter that are just in his head.
Yeah. Before that, especially the business about Antigua. And there are all kinds of arguments about Sir Thomas actually being an abolitionist versus, a slaveholding guy. And there were examples of that on Antigua in particular, I've read. But that may be one reason that Austen keeps a lot of things hanging out there until she reveals some of what's going on in his head before. You're right, though. We see him talking, interacting with other characters, and have a fairly good sense of him in certain roles, certainly as the patriarch in the family, right?
Well, one thing along those lines is by bringing Susan in, by bringing Fanny's sister to Mansfield Park, he realizes that there's value in bringing up his niece, bringing her to Mansfield Park, improving her life, and that he misses all those girls around. Mariah's gone off in the gulag, and Julia's about to get married, and Fanny won't be there all the time, and Lady Bertram needs an assistant, and he likes another. It would be too quiet, I think, at Mansfield Park.
But what about Susan? Does this look like the same cycle that what are they thinking about her future? Were they actually thinking about Fanny's future? Henry Crawford's offer was kind of a fluke, right?
It was a fluke.
So there's that. I mean, I think Austen just mixes it up, tosses a lot at us in that final chapter. It sounds like Susan is going to be the permanent substitute, and we go, oh my God, is this starting again?
But Susan knows, and she's heard from Fanny, how much better life is at Mansfield Park. Even if she's an assistant and sits with Lady Bertram, she gets better. Who else? Somebody pointed out better food, better clothes, better surroundings, better air. They lived in it was a hovel in Portsmouth, and poor, and really unpleasant compared to Mansfield Park, even in a room without heat. But Fanny had her own room.
Yeah.
And Susan may not be so fortunate as to have somebody like Henry or Edmund to propose to her, but she will be introduced to a different kind of company at Mansfield than she would have in Portsmouth.
And if we were writing sequels, probably there's been something written about Susan for all I know.
I'm sure. no doubt.
Imagine all kinds of things. But that's, that's why Austen is such fertile ground for people writing sequels and spins of various kinds. Let's talk about the title. Why is this book not entitled Fanny Price the way Emma is titled Emma?
Good question.
Why is it not, say, humility, like persuasion is persuasion,
Boring.
or
No, humility.
or
That sounds like a
Pride and
sermon
Prejudice,
title.
Sense and Sensibility, the more of a thematic title.
Well,
It's the
you know
name of a
what?
place.
You pointed out that this is a different book, and you've been repeating all the ways that Jane Austen has thrown it up and brought it down in different ways, and how wide-ranging this novel is, even geographically. So I think it needed a different title. I think it needed a title of place that it is the place that changes Fanny's life, and it is the place that is the focal point. Does it count as the focal point of this merry-go-round of all the things that start to happen?
Yeah, it's the locus where everything is critiqued, investigated, the family, the people who come in, seeing it that way. But there is Northanger Abbey, and Sanditon, but Jane Austen did not title those books. In fact, she was calling Sanditon the Brothers as a working title, I think. And in fact,
She didn't title Northanger Abbey.
No, and she did not title Persuasion either. Her siblings did. So, and in fact, remember she called Northanger Abbey was Susan when she sold it to Crosby. The first
and wasn't, I think, Sense and Sensibility was originally Eleanor and Mary Ann.
Yes, and she changed.
Yeah.
And Pride and Prejudice was First Impressions.
First Impressions, right?
Which works to some extent.
Yeah.
But Mansfield Park is different. And remember the name Mansfield? Why did some people think that's significant?
Oh, was that the anti-slavery?
Yes. We really gave that short shrift. We could not go down all those paths that in fact open pretty widely as we were charting our way through this novel, really tracking with characters and plot and just what's going on, why. But Lord Mansfield was the one who made rulings in the 18th century that in England, man who had been enslaved could not, I can't remember the details, but it was really a significant ruling. And so it's associated. So some people have argued that because of the name of the novel, they would argue Sir Thomas, et cetera, et cetera. But she just drops that in there, talking about the slave trade. And there are all kinds of analogies we can make. How much are women women in the 19th century, for better or worse, did compare themselves. People who had no choices, had no way to control their funds, etc. But so anyway, that's just something to think about, because this book has been called a condition of England novel, that it's a kind of measure of the situation that Austen is depicting to us writ large. And of course, to get there, we have to understand all the nuts and bolts getting us there. But did I just see something come across asking about Liz to tell us a little bit more about her spin on Mansfield Park?
There's not that much to tell. Just
Intense.
super briefly. Yeah. So I was motivated. I may have mentioned this at the beginning, but I'm a recently retired high school English teacher. And as part of my job, I used to read a lot of young adult fiction. And I was just intrigued by the formula of young adult fiction. Like one time I was reading 2 books at the same time, one an audiobook during my drive and then a hard copy next to my bed. And I happened to be marching through the 2 books in a parallel way, which made me realize these 2 novels, even though they were both pretty good, they were so formulaic and following the same form. And so then I was thinking about Mansfield Park, and I was thinking how much it has in common with a YA novel. So, all of the main characters are very young. Shockingly young when you think about Henry, Crawford, you know, these like adult decisions that these characters are making. They're so young. And the whole plot of like daddy's out of town and we're going to throw a big party while he's gone. And then he comes home in the middle of it. And even just the trope of this really cute boy, you know, says he likes me, but I don't know if he really does or not. I don't know if I can trust him or not. And you know, the cute boy who flirts with two different girls at the same time. It's all, you know, so straight out of young adult. So I thought it would be fun to try to retell it. But, you know, I have the same problem with this that like all the people who've tried to adapt it into film do, and that Fanny's just not a very compelling YA character. You know, and you know, I've been playing around with this and trying to make like really highlight her as an introvert with a strong moral sense. And one of the things I like about, I mean, one of the things I'm exploring in this thing that I'm trying to write is the complicated feelings of class and how, you know, how troubled Fanny is when she goes back to Portsmouth and has to reassess her own home, and how painful that is to see that. And you know, thinking about like my modern character, in my head, she both judges the rich people she stays with, which Fanny really doesn't, but my character is gonna. And yet, you know, she falls in love with the comforts too and feels that sort of ambivalence. So I'm trying to write that. I'm not really a writer, I don't think. So this is more just like an extended exploration of Jane Austen. It's just like a different way for me to play around with how much I love Jane Austen, as opposed to like any effort to write something that would stand on its own, if you know what I mean. But, and I just want to say something else about that. One of the things that just struck me again as I was rereading is I think it's just like one little line during the Portsmouth chapters where it talks, where the narrator tells us that Fanny's mother, you know, shares so much in temperament with her sister, Lady Bertram, and she would have been fine if she had married someone rich. But you need a temperament like Mrs. Norris to get by on a small income. And I think that's an interesting idea in this book too, that these characters are born with certain temperaments, and then through fate, through luck, whatever, they land in certain circumstances. And sometimes the temperament and the circumstances combine to something good. I mean, Lady Bertram's awful, but everything's okay because they're rich and she's got Sir Thomas to be her moral guidance, right? And, you know, it's just bad luck that Frances, I guess, Fanny, the elder, you know, just doesn't have that. And it just makes you think about the luck, you know, that's involved with Fanny's transplant or Susan's transplant. And, you know, things could have turned out really different for them.
Well, here's something that just occurred to me as you were talking, Liz, is that in the Portsmouth family, Fanny is permanently gone, Susan is permanently gone, William now has his appointment in the Navy, and the two younger boys can't wait to get on a boat. And so, and they get on boats when they're young adolescents.
Yeah.
And so Mrs. Price will be alone.
With that bratty little
girl,
sister.
Right. What's her name? Betsy?
Betsy. Yes.
Yeah.
Unless the success of the children somehow affect the parents' life. That is perhaps the most sophisticated, mature realization that I think Sir Thomas makes in that last chapter, where he understands that he has also felt useful, because through his agency, he has helped not only William Price and Fanny, maybe now Susan, but the rest of them get settled in the world in some way. And that strikes me as Jane Austen celebrating the professions and the middle class that she does. She does to some extent in Emma, in a broader range with farmers, etc., but certainly in Persuasion, where we've got all professional men. The men of the Navy are the honorable ones, the ones who are useful, doing something in the world. And that really seems a trajectory that Austen is taking in some of her novels. And I think it's an interesting one. Anything else?
Well, it looks like Melissa's brought up a whole new point, a whole new topic of conversation, which again leads me to want to start this all over again. Because this is, I'm just going to say that how much fun this has been and how enjoyable this has been. And Joellen, thank you. And Melissa, thank you for organizing
Absolutely.
and sending out questions and keeping this going through the summer, even with some of us in and out. But this has really been a highlight of literary fun. So thank you.
I
Amen.
agree.
And
And,
thank you.
and really, thanks to everyone. I mean, people have been in and out as they've needed to be. We've lost a number of people along the way, but really glad to see you again, Judith. And so anyway, it's really, we see just how much these novels can keep on. I don't even know how you do that. I'm not
Oh,
sophisticated.
look at the bottom of your screen. There's a word react and a heart. So
Oh,
you click on
I
that
can't
word.
deal. I can't deal with
Susan
everything.
just did it too.
But okay, let me
Bill
know
Patchwork.
that anybody in the area who'd like to go down to Holland and watch Patricia Rozema's film Mansfield Price with people and talk about it there, please know you're welcome. I'll be driving from Grand Rapids, and if some of you and maybe some other people who have been part of this in the past, like Jean isn't here tonight. I'm so sorry she couldn't make it, but we could certainly, just do at some point a quick talk about that Mansfield Park. And because it's just there's a whole lot to say about what's going on there. And I watched it again recently, and I was amazed at how well Patricia Rozema does what she sets out to do.
I agree.
Putting that in relation to the novel is a whole different thing. So it really is really rich.
A
Then
film
the
is
last
something
thing I
different.
want to know is
A film
that
is something different. It's fun.
yeah. What's her name? Brody. Inger Brody put out a book this year called The Price of Happiness or something like that. But she talks about the endings of all of the novels by Jane Austen. And I thought, oh yes, I'm going to whip through this, and that didn't happen. But that's something that I want to be doing. And I don't know whether, we might every 3 months decide, okay, read a chapter, talk about it. But let me know if that might be something you'd be interested in. We've talked about in the West Michigan chapter doing something, even short hits, like 5-minute reports on what Brody talks about in certain endings. And that would be fun, but it wouldn't get us very far. But and Susan Ford's new book is a very different one. We really couldn't get into very much that she talks about with the reading and whatever, all of the illusions, but it's fascinating also. Brody's is more accessible and more broadly useful, I think. But so anyway, that's it. Anything else from anyone?
No, just thank you very much.
Well, you all, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Great to see you all.
Me too.